All right, so the second poem that I have is entitled I Talk Black. This poem actually came about, I used to be a teacher at Lakeland Elementary Middle. And I remember I overheard like a conversation between two young girls. And, you know, most of y'all have heard this before. One girl is like, "You talk so white," to another girl. And, you know, I asked, like, what does it mean to talk white? Like, what does that mean? She's like, she's so proper. And I'm like, okay, so if talking white means to speak properly, what does it mean to talk Black? And I walked away from that conversation, not with an answer, of course, but inspired to write a poem. And that's how this poem came about. And I'd like to share that with you all and bid you adieu this morning. All right, here we go. I have been folding my tongue beneath itself, bleaching my language, clenching my jaw with shackled teeth, because the moment I open my mouth, uprising spring from my saliva, my dialogue is cruddy. Sampled with the muddy boots of trade and migration, battling nations in my diaphragm, so the rhythm in my diction sounds like a war cry. And despite the white stuffed down my windpipe, I talk Black with nappy phonics, syllables that kink and twist, naughty expression that beads on my palate, soul glow in this spit shine flow, Jerry curl jargon, bongo drums in my diction. This slang is semantic resistance, off with the head of the king's English. Can't you smell the riot on my breath? Char in my esophagus, my laugh is arsenic. And ain't enough opiates in this elementary education to hook me on phonics or gentrify the djembe out of my pronunciation. Love the taste of this cornbread accent. Sugarcane slang my tongue is, motherland, mama of civilization, birth of every nation, scat, boom, bat, hi-hat, jazz sax. There is music in my melanin, and I be talking super Black with a neck roll to articulate my tone. Conversations get you high as my cheekbones, and lingo about lush as these hips done grown. Thick thighs and deep fried vernacular. Hand motions and sound effects. Hieroglyphics hidden in my messages. My breath is the building of the pyramids on repeat. I'm like a Negro spiritual sampled over a trap beat. There is a Black anthem inside my belly, so I will always lift every voice and speak. Thank y'all so much again.
Yo, you better do that. You hear me?
Rock it out, Brianna. Rock it out.
So I hope y'all enjoyed. That's my time. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. The way that you just took like your ideas and was able to share them out like that is like every time you perform, I get chills, honestly. But now we will hear from students, parents, and advocates from the state about what they will have, what they have experienced in their schools and why this work is so important. So first up is Andrea Seawood. Andrea is a student in Prince George County and is one of the founding members for Team for Justice in Prince George County.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Seawood. I'm 14 years old, and I like to play the piano, bake sweets, and decorate my room. I am also a part of a nonprofit organization named Teams for Justice, located in PG County. Teams for Justice works to fight institutional racism and racial injustice in our communities. We started with the desire to bring awareness to the need for change by protesting in our local neighborhoods and promote the Black Lives Matter movement. We teens had an opinion about what was happening in our world when we began, and we are trying to make a difference. As our organization became better known, I am more inspired to want to continue to do more and bring attention to our cause. As a person of color, I've unfortunately dealt with racism at school. The elementary school and middle school targeted and treated children of color more harshly than children that are not of color. I remembered this one incident at lunch. My friends and I were playing a game that included finger guns. When the teacher saw us, she only took me to the office and called my mom. I received a week of in-school suspension from that incident. My friends at the time were white and didn't receive any disciplinary action towards them. It made me feel angry and upset, but I also felt powerless because I was a kid. I believe it is wrong to treat kids this way and needs to change, from the way school systems train teachers, discipline policies, to school board rules, actions, and curriculum requirements. Schools should be open and honest when it comes to the education of students and not teach them the whitewashed version. I was never taught about Black history in school. Slavery was called indentured servitudes, and we were never taught about racism as it exists today. Thinking back, we also didn't learn much about other cultures in history. I remember when we were learning about Virginia history and how Indigenous people hunted and made clothes, teachers would call them the Indians, and all the students laughed and made jokes about the name. Ever since then, on all the tests, quizzes, and assessments, they were known as the Indians. I am lucky because my parents were there to advocate for me. They decided it was in my best mental, emotional, and educational interest to take me out of public school and allow me to be homeschooled. I can now focus on my academics, and more importantly, I no longer feel hopeless. Kids who have dealt with racism in school should speak up, and they know that they don't deserve to be treated differently because of the color of their skin. No child should feel the hopelessness caused by racism, especially in schools. We have a voice and ability to make a change. I want my voice not only to be heard, but a call to action for all.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing your story. That was very important because at the end of the day, this is like who we're trying to help, our own people, like students of POC. If you have not already seen it though, in the chat, Lady Breon put in her social media, and there is also an about page for her. Next, we will hear Dr. LaShawn Stitt, a longtime educator and founder and director of Educate the World, LLC, based in Baltimore County.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm so amazed at the turnout today. And I'm originally from New York, so I'm going to share my experiences from New York as a mom, as well as an educator, and coming here to Baltimore as an administrator and also as an entrepreneur. My experiences in school were a little bit different in New York. We definitely did not learn much about Black history. I had a mother who was an educator, hence me being an educator as well. And it was extremely important that we visited the mosque on 116th Street and were enlightened by the words of Brother Malcolm X. And growing up in that type of environment, I saluted a red, black, and green flag. So the presence of culture was relevant, and it was really influenced by my mom. And as I grew older and became a mom myself, my oldest son experienced somewhat of racism. I didn't realize it because I was a young mother, but something as simple as obtaining a library card by a older white librarian became somewhat of a challenge because she didn't feel at 5 that he was capable of signing his name and having the responsibility of obtaining a library card. And as I grew older, I had 2 other children. Their experience was not the same, but coming to Baltimore County, there was the absence of culture. There's the absence of recognizing young people of color and just the true history. So as a professor at CCBC, I made it my business to encourage my students and inform them. So my curriculum included, as Lady Breon shared with us earlier, the prison industrial complex. Many of my students were not aware of who Thomas Jefferson was and the role that he played. And that just came from just the colonizing of our American system of education and the lack of truth and honesty that exists there. So my job, and as my ancestors continue to summon me and fulfill and walk in my purpose, I will continue to enlighten those who look like me and who do not look like me, to know that our history is extremely important. It needs to be included because our young people of color need to know not only that they are relevant, but they have laid the foundation, and their ancestors have laid the foundation. So in essence, I just feel like the shifting of the education system needs to occur, and we need to include a curriculum that is representative of all people of color, and just dismiss the whitewashing that we have been accustomed to for so long.
Thank you, Dr. Stitt. It's important to know that like we can hear the stories from both inside and outside of Maryland. If you haven't seen Facebook and on Instagram, Teens for Justice at PG County. And next we will hear Moralise Urbano, who is a recent graduate of PG County, PG Public Schools, and now in her first state of Morgan State. So now we will hear from Moralise.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Moralise Urbano, and I am a fully undocumented student at Morgan State University. I graduated from High Point High School in Prince George's County and have been working with PG Changemakers and PG County Board of Education in work groups to abolish the presence of police officers at a school, the school to prison pipeline, and redirecting funds to mental health programs. During my years of high school, I endured firsthand, and like many other students, the inequalities of the police system, and being Black and undocumented, the risk of me being deported or incarcerated are twice as much in a school environment where my human response to stress will be treated by a police officer that is trained to kill instead of a mental health professional that is trained to understand me. I have met friends that have been put in handcuffs in detention rooms at a school, and I have had friends who have been physically abused by these authorities. At the end of the day, I believe that school funds should be redirected to mental health professionals that can help the students instead of, being a harm to the student body. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Moralise. Christian Givens is the president of Cecil Solidarity, which has been working hard to educate the school community in Cecil County about anti-racism.
Cecil County.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Givens, as she mentioned, and I am the president of, it's called Cecil Solidarity. So if you guys have heard of Cecil County, you might turn your face up a little bit because I'll explain that in a second. So we are a local grassroots organization in Cecil County, Maryland that formed last year after the George Floyd murder to stand up for racial and social justice locally here. So our goal in Cecil County is to create a Cecil for all people. That's our mantra, especially those who have been historically left out, which we know include our Black and Brown people. Before I get started, I just want to thank you all for having me on today to represent Cecil Solidarity and Cecil County at large, because often we are missed because we are such a small county and a very right-leaning county. Need I say more? And we appreciate you including us in this very, very important and necessarily and also timely conversation. So for those of you that don't know about Cecil County is historically known for racism. And at one point, it was also coined as the Klan capital of the world. So there have been numerous incidents. The Washington Post actually came out earlier this year and did a huge story, a front page story actually on Cecil County and the racism that exists here. So Cecil Solidarity, as you can tell, was needed. And we're here to say, despite naysayers and lots of protests and lots of threats. So since we formed last June, and particularly in the last 10 months or so, we've been behind the scenes looking at different ways on how our current policies and practices in K through 12 public education contribute to persistent racial inequities in education and inequalities in education. And we've been attending the local school board meetings since the summer of this year when they started allowing the public to be there in person. And we also started seeing a lot of people that listen to Fox News come and just be very belligerent and very ridiculous. So we were attending in person to counteract the ignorance and to talk truths and to present truths. So we've had numerous discussions to ensure or help ensure that educational leaders at our local school system understand the urgency of doing anything and everything that they can to create and foster, a safe and inclusive learning environment so that all of our students, especially our Black and Brown students that have been historically left out and left behind, can have the opportunity to thrive academically, social, and emotionally. At the most recent board meeting last month on October 13th, I spoke in front of everyone and shared with our board members and local leadership about numerous harmful and disturbing experiences, yet again, that have taken place in only the first few months of school to Black students in particular. In a span of a few weeks, one of my vice president of Cecil Solidarity, her kids specifically, and a few other children that we know have been called slaves, monkeys, nigger, etc. And the consequences for the children that are spreading that hate have basically been a slap in the face. They don't really have consequences. And we learned that they don't have consequences because they don't have anything in the current student handbook, including specific language that clearly addresses and condemns hate speech. So while one of these incidents, as we know, is enough to merit an immediate call to action, we know that these are not isolated incidents, and we've created a petition to demand that changes be made to the current student handbook to include specific language that clearly addresses and condemns hate speech, including explicit and implicit racist comments, Islamophobic comments, xenophobic comments, anti-Semitic comments, sexist comments, and other vile, threatening, and harassing speech. And we've also requested that appropriate consequences come in place if a student engages in this hateful behavior, because again, like I said, if a student punches you in the face after you call them a nigger, they are suspended. But the student that does the name calling and actually is worse, because words stick for years and years, it's that there is no consequence right now. So we are demanding that there's a clearly defined policy that crucially signals to everyone, students, teachers, staff, and our community at large, that this behavior is completely unacceptable and will be forbidden moving forward. So we strongly believe that every single student, especially our Black and Brown students, deserve access to a positive, safe learning environment, and it's the responsibility of all of us to protect them. So Cecil Solidarity is leading that charge and have been working on trying to work with local organizations as well, including our NAACP that are active, but we're a little bit more active. So we're leading the charge and we're hoping that other people join. So next week we'll be attending the November school board meeting on Wednesday, and we'll be presenting them with our recommended framework of what we believe should be included in this amendment to the existing student handbook policy, and are going to be looking to align it to the current bullying policy so that it makes sense, because it is a form of bullying, even extreme bullying, I would call it. So our hope is that we can get an official board meeting on the calendar with all of us, local organizations led by Black and Brown people in Cecil County and neighboring communities, if they choose to do so, to discuss this in a real way and get this started. So I'll end this by asking all of you to keep us in your thoughts and prayers if you are a praying people, and if not, send us good energy and good vibes your way. And if you feel compelled to do so, I can include it if it's appropriate. Frank, just let me know. Sergio, let me know. I'll include it in the chat. If you feel compelled to do so, to sign our petition and share it within your networks as well, so that we can all together call on the Cecil County Board of Education to change this by getting numbers, names, and then a conversation behind the scenes, and then a task force hopefully created so that we can get this policy updated and protect our students. So thank you all for having me, and I look forward to the rest of this meeting and continuing this conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Christine. It's important to say, like Frank said, we do stand with you. And like when we say Maryland, we don't just mean Baltimore City or like PG County, but we mean all of Maryland. And thank you all for sharing. So moving on to the next part of our program, we do want to take a deeper dive into what's going on around the county, or what's going on around the country. And here in our state, we related racism in our schools. So we're going to hear about what anti-racism practice looks like in the classrooms and what is absolutely like indispensable to our success, to the success of Black and Brown students in every county throughout our state. I proudly present to you Dr. Khalilah Harris to give the keynote address. Dr. Harris is currently Managing Director for K-12 Education Policy at the Center of American Progress and holds degrees from Morgan State University and University of the Maryland School of Law. And during the Obama administration, she served as the first Deputy Director of the White House Initiative on Education Excellence of African Americans. That was a mouthful. And the capacity she conceptualized and launched the first African American woman lead convening to discuss educational equity at the U.S. Department of Education. She also managed the Diversity and Inclusion in Government Council and implemented the first White House Summit on Diversity and Inclusion in Government. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Khalilah Harris.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I got to take you with me wherever I go, so I could be like, okay, I have to talk to students about whatever it is I'm doing, but Sarah's going to introduce me because she has all the life and the energy. So thank you so much. I am going to share my screen if I can be made co-host. And I hope everybody has their feet firmly planted in the ground, that you are as delighted as I am to be here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to just be in community with you all this morning. And again, hearing the stories of everyone who shared their testimony, hearing the words of my former student, Lady Breon, and that is full circle moment. I met her when she was 13 or 14, and she was a new student at my school, and so many friends and co-conspirators here this morning. I'm so delighted to be here with you. So I'm gonna now, share my screen and run the show. All right. So Maryland is so Black, it's blue. So this is what I want to talk about, because I know we all experience in this state, sometimes doublespeak from our leadership. People like to talk about Maryland as a blue state, and we all have had experiences that feel very red, particularly with a Republican governor. For myself, as a 27-year resident of Baltimore City, having people talk about Baltimore as if we are sucking resources away from the rest of the state, yet people come here to work, they don't pay taxes here, they don't support the roads that we have here that they use, they don't support the resources that we have here that they use, but they're readily using dog whistle terms to talk about Baltimore City. And I think that people across the state may have experienced some of those things. So again, I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris. I am the proud mother of 3 daughters, and I do this work for them. So I want you to know that you can feel free to quote me on social media. My handle is @EdToBeFree on most channels, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If I say something that gets you upset, it's because I just want you to stand up straight if I step on your toes. So it's all right to say she says something that was wild and I don't agree, and put that on social media, and I'll interact with you and have continued dialogue. All right, so let's dive right in. Anti-racism in schools. There are transactional and transformational ways to address this. You see on the transactional side, and transactional means things that we do to kind of check a box, things that we do to pat ourselves on the back and say that, we know what we're talking about, we're using the right words, or we've done everything we can on policy to make sure the majority of students attending public schools in America and in the state of Maryland, per our last census, but I think we knew that already, are Black, Native, Latinx, and other people of color. And we can be transactional in the things we do by compliance, as opposed to transformational, which are really planting the seeds to grow firm roots so that our children decades from now are experiencing an equitable access to education. On the transactional side, you hear terms like culturally responsive, and responding to something is good, but it's not sustaining or affirming. So some people in practice will say this should be culturally sustaining and affirming practice. More educators who are by POC versus educators of color with a liberatory praxis. And let me stop here for a second. All our skin folk ain't our kinfolk. And just because you hire more people who look like the children doesn't mean you are identifying people who have shared experiences, shared value systems with the people in your school district, with the families, with the children, with the ways that they've been raised. If you are taking an approach to equity and inclusion that is simply more faces that look like the children, you are very surface level. And that includes in the text that you're using. When my children start school every year, I know their teachers sometimes are wondering what I'm going to say at back to school night, but typically annually I will ask, particularly in our humanities and English, social studies classes, what kind of texts are being used that show Black kids being regular? Right? Not the civil rights movement, not a baseball hero, not an entertainer, but you know, this little girl is a detective and her little brother is annoying. You know, life experiences of average people. And that is usually the question that stumps. And the question, and the reason I push on that is around that concept of culturally sustaining, but also liberatory praxis, because if you are intending for children, for it to be normalized that children are a part of the everyday curriculum, exceptionalizing them, using texts that only show their community as exceptional or as stars and not as regular people, also sends a message. Equal resources versus equitable resources. I think many of us have gone through some experience where people are trying to explain the difference between equality and equity. And equity really is a tool that you use to get folk to the point where they can access resources or opportunities equally. You don't start at equality because that is inequitable. That doesn't address anything. You start at equity so that we can all have equal opportunity. Community input versus community decision-making. I'm sure as the pandemic has unfolded, some of you have participated in maybe a year ago, 18 months ago, whatever it may be, some kind of survey or town hall where you were asked, how should American Rescue Plan dollars be spent, but have not heard from anyone since then. Community decision-making has clear structures that allows for parents, families, just concerned citizens, and certainly students to be involved in decision-making about their schools. And for those of you who have been doing advocacy with your county council, your city council, at the state legislature, may have experienced writing a bill with a legislator, or you may have just experienced somebody coming by a community meeting, waving, saying you're important, and not seeing them again outside of election season. So those are the differences there. When someone says participatory government, that does not include, I'm going to write a grant proposal and the government, whether it's your city or county council, is going to give you a grant to do things that they should already be supporting you in. That is community input. That's not participatory government. Participatory means that you are actively involved in not only determining the plan, but accountability around the plan and a cycle of learning around what's happening with that particular thing. And then increased achievement on existing measures versus desired achievement on multiple community-driven measures. The concept that there is a single test that's going to tell us whether or not a school is meeting with success or children are meeting with success, that does not let parents know real time how their children are doing, that doesn't let students know real time how they're doing. It doesn't let educators know real time how their practice is impacting their students. Is not the standard for gaps in achievement, right? If we aren't measuring things that are not the standard, if we are not measuring things that are valued by community members, such as what are the relationships between educators and families who walk into the building, right? Or is it expected that if you come into my school building, you should be grateful for the opportunity to be here because we have the best school? If you see a parent come in a bonnet and pajamas, that your first response is, you need to get out of here. You can't be in my building that way, as opposed to, I'm so glad mama showed up to, you know, help partner to figure out what we're going to do for their child. And those are different ways of thinking. But whenever you hear people saying achievement gap, what kind of achievement? Achievement at what? And is it on an assessment that is biased in and of itself because it is framed from a single worldview? So Maryland, this conference is amazing, and I'm so glad to be here again, particularly because it's student-led, but there have been multiple attempts to pursue justice on the education front, particularly around racial equity. You see Howard County attempts to redistrict to provide access to students across their community to schools that are deemed as excellent. Same thing in Montgomery County. We've had in Baltimore the Bradford versus Maryland State Board of Ed decision that was targeted at providing Baltimore City students, and particularly students with special needs, access to a quality of education that has a baseline of excellence and isn't, you can get what you can get when we give it. We saw the Thornton Commission come down statewide about how schools are funded and to make sure that there was equitable funding. And then we had the housing crisis of 2007, 2008, completely suspend the increases in resources going to schools. And now we have the Kerwin Commission, which seeks to pick up again with equitizing and making it more fair what resources are being provided to schools across the state. School boards, 22 fully or partially elected school boards in the state of Maryland. You may recognize the young lady on the right of the screen, who is formerly the superintendent in Queen Anne's County here in Maryland, that was driven out when she dared to say Black Lives Matter by the school board. Historically, school boards in the state of Maryland have been used to maintain racial dominance. Student voices on our school boards are not valued in the way that they should. So we pay a lot of lip service in many of our counties about students being on the board, but not having the right to vote on certain policies or certain matters with the rest of the board. Calls to change curriculum in recent history. We saw last year some powerful young people across the state, and especially in Baltimore here, demanding for there to be curriculum that is culturally affirming and responsive. And I want folk to understand that when you hear, even if it's culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, or culturally affirming, whichever phrase people are using, that is not code word for let's talk about Black kids, let's talk about brown kids. You can be anywhere, Western Maryland, right? And see kids whose parents work in a coal mine, see kids whose parents might be loggers or in other industries that you find in Appalachia. And it could be a room full of 30 blonde hair, blue-eyed white children. But if somebody comes in there talking about the environment and how we need to, protest this and protest that, and they're not talking to the children right in front of them, whose parents are working in those industries, they are not being culturally responsive or affirming. That's not to say that you don't have your beliefs about climate and about saving the planet and making sure we all have clean water and air. That means that you are conscious of the community that you're in, and that you're using their strengths to help bring them into understanding about critical thinking, problem solving, and analytical thinking. Right now, we have a resistance to establish a majority elected board in Baltimore. There's a lot of wait and see from everyone from the mayor to members of the existing school board. Let's just wait and see when 2 people get on the board, as if 2 people can make a difference of a group of folk who are appointed and not really accountable to anyone. There are external threats to hijack elections. We saw just this past Tuesday, a lot of conversation and a lot of money pumped in for people who are anti-critical race theory and anti-masking who were elected to some school boards. But what you should know is a great number of people did not get elected. People know their neighbors who they see in church pews, at the synagogue, at the mosque. People know their neighbors who were just shouting down the principal at the last school board meeting, or shouting down the CEO or members of the school board. And writ large, people know those people and did not vote them in. So let's not believe the hype that media would have you believe, and also certain politicians who are trying to stoke fear. School boards definitely, for that reason, a source of community influence, and oftentimes will succumb to maintaining hoarding of resources by some families. So, when I talk about Maryland being so Black it's blue and not being clear whether or not it's a red state or a blue state, on the previous slide, I talked about Howard County and Montgomery County And if you saw there, if you were able to watch any of those school board meetings or attend any of those school board meetings, you had very good liberals saying they did not want to redraw school lines because they pay their dues, they pay their taxes so that their children can go to those schools. And why would we allow anyone else into the community to have access to the resources that they've worked so hard for their children? And work so hard is code for a lot of things, as if other people aren't working hard by starting behind the finish line. We have the current commission, as I said, what it should do and what it didn't do. What it should do is provide us an opportunity to place better demands for more racially and linguistically diverse educator workforce, for the training for culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, and culturally affirming practice across all of our educators, and have that be a part of the standard for them being certified, whether they are teachers, whether they are guidance counselors, whether they are school leaders. That's what it should make space for us to do. It should allow for us to have more equitable access to resources in terms of money and programming going to historically disinvested school districts. What it didn't do is say those things explicitly. And so when we talk about accountability and when we talk about how the community is engaged in holding both the state board of education and their local school districts accountable, we want to make sure that we aren't making assumptions about how current makes space for anti-racist education. We also don't want to make assumptions about equitable access to resources and programming. We know with the Thornton Commission that the dollars that were allocated to provide more access to equity were frozen, and they were never reinstated. You know, the current governor likes to tout historic investments in education pre-pandemic, when really what he was doing was getting us back up to a pre-Thornton level. He did not expand access to resources, but there are a lot of word games that will have you confused about whether or not Maryland is doing its due diligence to provide equitable access to resources. So, you know, how do we get this done? We want to make sure we have a community vision for our schools, and that through initiatives and coalitions like ARMS, that we are making specific demands for how to make sure our schools are anti-racist and also providing equitable access to resources. So we want to know who works in our schools. Again, to my kinfolk ain't always skinfolk point. And not only that they're people of color, and we're going to the HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions and MSIs to find educators, but what are their value systems and what kind of certification practices will allow us to know those things about them? And also, how are our school leaders being trained to identify people who can see the assets in our children and not deficits, such as folk who go to Thanksgiving and say, well, my kids are I work at a Title I school, and my kids are this and my kids are that. Or, you know, these kids have such difficult lives where I work, which is really centering themselves. It really is not saying, you know, wow, I went to dinner with this one family because my student I had a solo in the church choir, and I was so happy to have the cooking from mom because I could tell she put her heart into it. Those aren't the conversations some people are having, even when they look like the children. And so I want to make sure that we are conscious about the nuances and also play the whole thing out beyond just racially diverse and linguistically diverse. There's also a question about values and whether or not people love our kids when they meet them, or are placing unrealistic expectations despite their lack of resources. Again, who's deciding what student achievement is, and what things are most important to know about our students' achievement, and when do we need to know it? So we're talking about systems of assessments and not a single standardized test. I will not say that those single standardized tests lack bias, but I will say if the ways that we implemented standardized assessments was more conscious of the lack of resources and the lack of equity and access to opportunity that our students face, they perhaps wouldn't be such a problem. But because they're so high stakes, and I always cringe when I see school leaders having rallies for state assessments, or having other than pep rallies, like having incentives and all this other stuff that should be placed around the first day of school, not around a single test that the child will not see, that their parent will not see, that their teachers will not see for months, right? So where is our value system? But in many ways, I can't blame those school leaders, because they have a superintendent coming down on them saying, you need to get your numbers up or you're out. And those numbers are not really about the children. How do we know what we're doing? So are there dashboards? Is there some public way to see what's happening? And what type of access should we have to the data? In Organizing for Success, I know you're going to talk a little bit about this afterwards, and you'll hear from Jamal and other people who are going to get more specific in organizing, but something that's always important to think about: who's at the table and who's not, right? We all have to check our own biases. We have to check our own biases. Now, does that mean that if you're from the hood, you worked your way out, went to college, live in a nice neighborhood, that you don't have a perspective on what your life was through lived experiences? No. But does it harm you to have someone with the current lived experience to share their stories and to give them the tools so they can speak for themselves, and you're not summarizing for other people? Idea advocacy, protest, accountability. Oftentimes, Black and Brown people find themselves in the protest phase of policymaking, and there is no reason for any of us to wait until the protest phase. The phases of policy start with an idea that you can work with an elected official, depending on where the policy is being implemented. If it's just a district level policy, it might be the school board, again, your city council, county council, or the state legislature. Any person has a right to say to an elected official, I'd like this to be turned into law. How can you help me? And that can move into a bill that they submit. Those ideas both shouldn't and don't typically just start with the elected official out of nowhere. It starts with the people. Then you advocate, you get other people on board with the ideas. And if those ideas pass, you move right to accountability to make sure implementation is quality. If those ideas don't pass, you can surely protest to put pressure on people who are supposed to be representing you. And that goes to that reflective cycle. We need to play the long game. We know that there are folk who are much more conservative and are anti-critical race theory, although I have my feelings about even discussing critical race theory, which is not necessarily a clear line. Folk have played the long game, and the same people who have been trying to deny voting rights are the same people who are calling themselves anti-CRT. All of those things go together. So we have to be sure we are organizing around firm principles, that we are preparing people to run for office and take office, run for school board, sit on the school board, groom them up to become teachers and principals in our schools, and make sure that there are policies that allow for elimination of student debt so our families can be recruited and retained into teaching, that there are strategies and policies for training around culturally sustaining and affirming practice, that those things all go together and take time. And a lot of the times we find ourselves at the protest phase because something hits the wall, we go to the state legislator and we're ready to fight, right? But the other side, they play a very long game, a very long game. And so it's important for us to rethink how we use the policy-making process to get what we need. So it's not checkers, or is it? I always say to people who say it's not checkers, it's chess, I ask them if they realize how hard it is to play checkers. And it's just a different type of game. So while we may have been playing checkers while other people play chess, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to get people prepared to cross the board. And that is critical for us. So I'm gonna stop here. Stop share. And that's that on the keynote front. We'll get into it on the panel, but again, thank you all for being here. I am now going to introduce a phenomenal panel of people. And I want to make sure that our tech support in the background will pin these people. First, Desiree Tucker is a parent in Frederick County, and she's a leader in the group End Racism in Frederick County Public Schools. She's also founder and executive director of Women Solve. Jadi Omawale is co-director of the Culturally Responsive Teaching Program housed in the Community College of Baltimore County. Bobby Holmes, my brother, is a licensed social worker and founder of Son of a Dream, which is committed to the success and development of Black youth and families. And he has also done extensive advocacy work through journalism and media production. And last but not least, Edwin Perez is a high school Spanish teacher in Baltimore County Public Schools after spending many years as a teacher in the city school system. He's been working extensively in the Latinx community in Baltimore, advocating and facilitating support services and programming for children and families. And so as we proceed, I just want to make sure the panelists know that this is a conversation. I may ask one of you a question, but if the spirit moves any of you to jump in, please jump in. Something I would love for those of you viewing to think about when you think about anti-racism. There is certainly anti-racism. There is also anti-Blackness. And, you know, when people meet me and they're talking, and they're like, we need to get some Hispanic people in the room to talk about, you know, Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm like, that's dope. I can talk about it. And they're looking at me like, what do you mean? And I'm like, I can talk about it. My family is Costa Rican, I'm Afro-Latina. How do we move forward? And so we all have to really interrogate how we think about race, racism, experiences of people. Again, when I say all my skin folk ain't my kinfolk, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. So though I've been in Baltimore for 27 years, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and everybody was from somewhere. And all of the Latino people I knew looked like me. And it wasn't until I moved into other communities where I knew, you know, obviously I know Puerto Ricans, I know Dominicans, I know Colombians, Costa Ricans, whatever, who don't look like me. I know Mexicans, obviously, who don't look like me. But in my community, anti-Blackness is very pervasive. And sometimes people hold on to their adjacency to whiteness when it suits them. So we all have to be thoughtful. When we think about the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, my team is about to do some research about their experiences in public education. And we've come to a decision we can't write about the AAPI community because the Pacific Islander community has very different experiences from the many, many cultures inside the Asian American community. And being racially explicit when you're doing your work. There's a large population of new Americans in Maryland. Even in Baltimore City schools, the fastest growing population are Latin American people. And so, you know, it's important for us to be specific. It's important for us to name things. You can see in my profile that I sit on Lenape land. I was born on Lenape land in Brooklyn, New York with the Canarsie tribe. I live on Lenape land here in Baltimore from the Susquehannock tribe. Being precise and being explicit and not making blanket statements will also help us get to anti-racism. So let's get into these. We will hold time towards the end for some questions as well. So I would like to start with you, Jadi. You are, yes, you are the director of the Culturally Responsive Teaching Program at Community College of Baltimore County, like I said earlier in your intro.
Yes.
When in the midst of training, I'm sure you've had people ask you the question, why do we even need to talk about race? Will you talk about how you engage around that?
First, I have to thank you for your talk. I'm a lifelong learner, like everyone else, I'm sure, in this room. And I always absorb and add to whatever I know from what other people speak. And I really appreciate what you've spoken to the room this morning. I've been doing this work for about 8 years at CCDC, the largest community college in Maryland, although Montgomery College likes to say, no, we're bigger. Very diverse student base at CCDC. And we have been, I will say, struggling for many years, for about 16 years, to grow basically our cultural competency program, training program at the college. So it's a very long game. You have to get in it and stay in it. And even when you get pushed back, you have to keep moving forward with it. And that's what we've been doing. So the program itself is based on the work of Geneva Gay and based on the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and Etta Hollins and others, particularly early Black scholars and educators that were talking about this type of pedagogy back in the 80s. And so we've built that on the pillars of all of their work and scholarship, and really just understood that culture and race are always in every classroom, in every institution. You can't leave out culture, you can't leave out race. The country was founded based in constructed racial identities, and continues, all of our systems continue to be built on those original structures. So when I first began to do the training, I noticed a trend among our white participants. We train faculty first. That's how we started out, because we wanted faculty to understand that there was another way to educate our students. There was a way to go into classes and really see the students for whomever they show up to be. And that means if you have a student that has tattoos all over their bodies, right? If you have a student that shows up from the LGBTQ community, if you have Black students that are from Baltimore City versus Black students that might be from one of the counties, everybody in those seats, it's important for you to understand who they are, leave your biases out, and build knowledge with those students. But in the trainings, I saw a trend right away where when we do identity construction exercises, we ask people to identify themselves in 5 ways. And the white participants, nearly all of them were leaving their race out of their identities. And I began to have conversations with my other trainers, and I'm like, well, we're seeing this. We have to take this back to the people and tell them, you must include your racial identity. And that really changed things and began to shift things forward. And it's something that white people were not identifying. They did not see, whites do not see themselves as having a race. We're outside of that. We're the norm. We're universal. So even our most liberal and most woke, or whatever you want to call them, white educators, if they can't see themselves within that racial construction, that socially constructive racial prism, then they can't do the work. So that is something that at CCDC we've really been confronting, is that all of us have a race. We don't want to have a race because that's false construction, but it is the reality. And we have to start from the reality first. So I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I just wanted to put that out there and
Thank you.
And put that in the conversation.
Thank you, Juddy. And it's interesting because even in these debates going on right now, a couple of things happen. One, white parents are being interviewed as parents.
Yes.
On how they feel about how their children are being taught about race, but people aren't asking Black parents how they feel about how their children
exactly
being taught about race. And then there's this, we need to move to a place of love and a place of unity. And I'm like, if you don't see me, I can't unify with you.
No.
But we have research and we have data that tells us that every human who use it for the most part, who uses their senses, and I don't want to be ableist here, who uses the senses that they were born with, and for the most part, we all have sight. Those of us who don't have sight learn other ways to determine where people may be from. It may be through hearing their voice or whatever the case may be. But our immediate reaction is to identify someone's skin color.
Oh, yeah.
It is our immediate reaction, right?
Yes.
And so when people say, why do we even have to talk about this? My question is, you noticed I was Black the first time you started talking to me, right?
Yes.
And I noticed you were white. And so, and so that tells me whether or not I need to be on guard with you, whether or not you may have respect for my humanity. That tells me whether or not, I need to engage you with love, but firmly. So, the idea that we don't really have to talk about this in many ways is something used to diminish that white is not right and the rest of us are other, but you two have a race. And so I moved away in my own practice from using inclusion, because inclusion inherently means I own something and I'm working to involve you into my thing, as opposed to when I show up, I belong here. So I've shifted into the belonging space. When I show up, I belong here just like you belong here. And so I don't actually need you to include me because this is my space too. And I think that's a shift that a lot of practitioners have to move into, because inclusion means someone owns the space and everyone else is allowed to be involved, as opposed to this space begins with all of us and we come with open hearts.
Well, so that's what I love about the current way that we're shifting language constantly. I think we have to interrogate our language always pushing it forward. And that's the way we're transitioning into something more really liberating for everyone.
Absolutely.
So, I don't want to take up other panelists' time, but that's great. That's the way it's going.
Edwin, I want to pull you in here. You're a classroom teacher and you have been working with the New American population as well as the Latinx population here across the state for a couple of decades. Will you talk a little bit about the Kerwin Commission calls for a study on how to support English language learners. Will you talk a little bit about what you would want to see come out of that, what you think the best approaches are to make sure that New American students who, whether they themselves speak another language or their parents and guardians are speaking another language, that that study come forward with policies that are working for actual people who are closest to the issues.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, and good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, panelists, and good morning, guests. I'm happy to be here. My name is Edwin Perez. I'm a high school teacher, teach Spanish at Parkville High School in Baltimore County, and I'm a former city schools teacher at Baltimore City College High School, for those of you City Forever fans. I'm also currently an advisor for SOMOS, which is a student-led group called Students Organizing a Multicultural and Open Society out of the city. I wanted to first start off by defining the words Latino, Latinx, and Latina and Latine, because that's something that comes up a lot in our conversations. And how do we identify certain groups? I always, when in conversation with my students, I always say, how do you identify? I'm not going to label you. You tell me, and we choose. But it's always a conversation takes place before when we have these kind of panels and webinars. Well, what do you want me to call you, or how do you want to call? So. A very simplified way of doing this is that the Latinx has become a term that's starting to be used more and more in university circles and in communities groups, but the X is removed, is there to allow for inclusivity of other groups or groups, I hate to use the word other, but to allow more inclusivity, and usually in relation to gender identity and orientation. The Latina and Latino are still used as well, and so is Hispanic. So under the Latinidad umbrella, there are a number of terms, and it is a growing list of terms. Recently, Latine has also been brought into the circle, and Latinu. And so there are a number of other terms. And so I just wanted to share that with the community here that all the terms are acceptable and used. And so, we just ask what that individual refers to. I refer to myself as Latino and also Puerto Rican, and I use those interchangeably in the schools as well. As it relates to the needs of our immigrant and Latino or Latinx community in relation to the Kerwin Commission, as you mentioned earlier, it's a blueprint. It's now called the Blueprint for Maryland schools, and this Kerwin bill or this blueprint, they are focusing on equity. They also have a section where now they're going to focus on a working group for English language learners to support the needs of this group. This group has historically been underserved in many districts, and the goal for this work group is to accelerate achievement. It falls under the policy area number 4, which is more resources to ensure that all students are successful. And so that's the area that this working group falls under. And so the goal is to add more funding, an increase of 20% for each ELL pupil over the next couple of years, and also to increase student support centers and family support centers. So what I think should be included personally is that there are issues facing this particular community of ELL students, immigrant students, and Latino students that have to do with this sense of belonging, like you mentioned earlier, race, ethnicity, culture, identity. Sometimes these groups are isolated due to policies. Sometimes they're segregated due to policy. And there's a lack of communication because of language policies that don't exist in certain districts, to include the over 203 languages that are spoken at home by Maryland students from different places, 203 languages. And so when we think about policies and these commissions, are they thinking about communicating with those 203 backgrounds or linguistic backgrounds? And so I think accountability is the first thing. I think we need to go back and revisit the commission, the Kerwin bill, to make sure that the conversation has focused on the needs of this particular community, and not just, like you were saying earlier, for what over the years has become a word called hispandering, or pandering to a particular community, right? Just to make sure that it's a political thing, and any other rhetoric. Also recognizing cultural and ethnic and linguistic diversity. So linguistic diversity, removing linguistic oppression in within the classroom and within the schools, allowing room for multilingual learners to be represented, not just ELL labels. Also heritage learners in our classrooms, and also making space for the exited learners. So students that have recently exited programs, what are we doing to accommodate them and support them as they transition out of these programs? Recognizing the strengths and power of language. So the idea that language has power and strength, and how we use it, and to empower our young people to be part of these commissions, to have a place there, but using their language. How do they represent language? How do they use language to address these concerns? Expanding programs, creating programs that are, earlier you talked about sustainability or sustaining and beneficial. So it's not just creating the program and it doesn't benefit anyone or only benefits certain groups at that moment in time, but as they grow, and elevating what these students already bring with them in terms of knowledge, experience, and their heritage and expectations, improving communication, direct communication to homes, providing instruction to in multiple disciplines, so art, music, science, in the home languages, and acknowledging that families have needs outside of what just the classroom provides for them. So these wraparound services they talk about, make sure you know those are in place to provide health, safety, and wellness. And I have a list of other things, but I feel like I'm taking up too much time.
No, it's fine. I'm sure we can share resources following the event to those who register, but that's exactly where I was hoping you would go with this. And, you know, language is important, even the language we use to develop policy. I do not allow my team to use phrases like at-risk youth, because the only risk they face is of adults who don't care about them. I do not allow references to young people by using a label before you identify the child. So there are children who live with families with fewer resources. Do not call anybody low-income children. If you put that in writing for me, your piece will not be published, because the last I checked, most children don't have income. They don't have jobs. So identifying them in a manner that is deficit-based, as opposed to, you know, this community and this family has fewer resources. How do we make sure there is equitable access to opportunity in light of that?
It may take a lot longer to say, but say it, because there's power in language. Sometimes people say things like the kids we care about. Which kids are you talking about? You know, and you see this a lot in nonprofit spaces or spaces where folk have gotten a lot of money to do things in communities. And they say, you know, we work with the kids we care about. And I'm like, I don't know who you're talking about. Who do you care about? I don't know, because I don't see them here. They don't work at this organization. You might be serving them. So language is very important. And I love to hear that work you're doing. Desiree, I want to bring you in to talk specifically about some work you're doing in Frederick County. You know, how are you all? And please talk about your successes first. What great things have you been able to do? And then you can layer into what the challenges are, because I love for people to first hear and zero in on, again, the opportunities and our talents before saying, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem, because I think we know what the problems are. So please talk a little bit about what successes you've had in Frederick, and then, you know, sprinkle in what some of the challenges may be.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. You know, I think here in Frederick County, and I've been here since 2017, so I'm a newcomer. And I moved here with a then, you know, infant and a son who was 4, and now I have a 3rd grader and a 4-year-old. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed right away as my son went into kindergarten is their Black History, okay? Black History Month, February. What are you all doing? What do you have planned? I went to this kindergarten teacher and she said, well, we'll be recognizing all Americans. That's what we're doing. And you can go and talk to the principal about it. So I went to the principal and the superintendent, and from there then formed an organization called Women's Solve, and built that around a group of women coming together to focus on a single issue and solve that problem. And at the time I thought, it's, you know, we want more diversity in the curriculum, you know, and to me now that seems like such a, it's not even, the word diversity isn't even big enough to you know, really understand what I've learned and what I've seen over the last few years. But one of the things that Frederick County Public Schools finally did do a couple of years ago was to recognize within the month of February, Black History Month globally at every school. Previously, it had been up to schools to decide whether or not they wanted to even recognize that month, that, you know, our contributions. Each school got to decide what they wanted to do, whether or not they wanted to just ignore it completely. And at my son's school, that's what was going on. It's elementary school. It just decided, oh, you know, we're just gonna act like this isn't happening and we're gonna celebrate all Americans. So now they have an essay contest in the month of February. I call it an exercise in self-learning, because students, you know, on their own get to write an essay, and then they enter a contest and are able to submit them to the school, and they appear in a video. So that's one thing that, you know, has changed. That's not enough, but, you know, as you talked earlier, and Jadi said it as well, it's a long-term commitment to see changes happen. The group in racism, FCPS, was formed by former students, and what that group has been able to do is unite the students, former students, within this community in a way that I didn't see before, and bring them together to tell their stories about what's going on with them in their schools, what happened while they were in school. They got over 2,000 responses, you know, on an online forum with story after story after story, and people that wanted to share. So that was a big success. It got the attention of the Board of Education and the superintendent, and you know, they had some meetings, no changes yet, but some meetings. So those are just a couple of small, little, I'll say, successes.
Let me stop you there and say, there are a lot of people right now who are afraid to speak up as some very loud voices come into their school boards and in their communities. And I would admonish you not to call what you did small, because there are so many people who won't take the first step.
Absolutely.
You know, I want to reject what you just said about a couple.
You know, I say small because to me, you know, it feels like crumbs, right? We've been receiving crumbs.
Language is important, though.
Right?
Language is important. Language is important.
I absolutely.
You got big crumbs. How about that?
Well, okay, we did get big crumbs, you know, but I have, you know, and my expectation is, if we're coming to you with, again, asking, how can we help? You know, here we are as a group of parents. We don't have enough teachers of color. I love your slide earlier talking about it's not just about sticking, you know, teachers of color in classrooms. You know, what's the background? How they've been trained? You know, it's all of that. We don't have enough teachers of color here. Okay, and you know, when I'm coming to you as a board and saying, you have a problem here, you know, you have a problem here, you've identified it. How can I help? You know, me, myself, and a bunch of other parents said, we'll host teachers for free. They can come and live with us, you know, for free, so that they can save up their money, just so that we can get teachers to come here. You're saying that, oh, well, we don't pay as much as they do over in Montgomery County. Fine, we've got a solution for that. You know, always about the solutions. And my expectation is always, okay, for people to jump on it. Here we are, we're trying to help. And it's getting doors slammed in your face over and over and over again. But you just, as you said earlier, and Dottie said earlier, you have to keep going. It's tiring. This is exhausting work, exhausting. So not to diminish or to say that it's small, but to me, there's so much more, and it's never enough. Never enough.
But it's the long game. You're not going to eat. You're not going to eat if you don't set the table.
Yes.
So you're not going to reap the rewards of the harvest if you haven't planted any seeds. And again, there are plenty of people unwilling to plant the seed, or they're just afraid, or, you know, there's so many other things around them. So I just want to congratulate you on that. And I think I might have cut you off. Did you have another thought you wanted to add on there?
No, thank you.
All right. So let me bring my brother Bobby in here. Bobby has been doing amazing work as a Black social worker, as someone who loves on our kids, as a Morgan State University alum, let's go Bears, who, you know, really has been relying on student voice and lifting up their capacity to tell their own stories. So Bobby, I want to pull you in here and ask you to talk a little bit more about the work you've been doing in Baltimore and across the state to help them build up strong Black identities, and, you know, how providing mental health supports can be critical to building an anti-racist public education system.
Sure.
You can do it, Bobby.
I struggle with the anti-racist part. I'm not 100% confident, folks, that we can get there with an institution. I don't mean to be pessimistic. I'm just being transparent in how I feel. Due to the long-standing and persistent racism that's been perpetuated throughout all systems, not just our school system. I am inclined to agree with Brother Derek Bell when he talked about the permanence of racism. I know you have your thoughts, Dr. Harris, about critical race theory, but I'm inclined to agree with him about the permanence of racism. And it's embedded in this country's DNA. And I'm not completely confident that can be changed. So I have to preface, you know, what I'm about to say about my work, and I can't necessarily say I work towards that goal because I'm not fully confident that I believe in that. But I will say throughout my work, just years of just showing up and supporting Black youth and families and Baltimore City and the surrounding counties the best I can, and trying to hold space for them to honor, particularly working with Black boys, honor our Black boys, uplift our Black boys, and the therapeutic space, but also engaging youth in workshops. I've been fortunate enough, Elevate Baltimore, being a partner of Elevate Baltimore, been fortunate enough, and other organizations and programs, community-based Black-led organizations, to partner up with them to offer my workshops where I teach youth about the traumatic impact of community violence and various protective factors. One of those protective factors being Ujima, collective work and responsibility, where we teach our youth that they too have a stake in their community. They too can address the issues impacting their community, and showing how through direct social action. One of those direct social actions is, for example, getting involved with the Baltimore ceasefire. So just uplifting our youth in that space, also through Reflection of Kings, which is a youth development and media program for Black boys, where we teach Black boys to explore who they are, engage with Black men in the community, using media to do so. So we having honest and courageous conversations with our Black boys about the issues that's impacting them, and helping them to engage with Black men who are actively doing the work, and helping them to understand that despite the narrative, there are Black men that are active and showing up, and Black men are assets in their community, to their community and their families. So that's why we've been intentional with specifically engaging them with Black men. And that's, just some of the work I do.
Just take another minute though for me, Bobby, to talk about, mental health and making sure, what I hear you saying, that our children are fortified and able to withstand the things that are coming at them, that are coming at them from centuries ago, and that are coming at them every day that they wake up.
And I guess this speaks to really the challenges within social work, human services at large, right? Like just in education, you have folks in the human service sector just unequipped, basically to serve Black and brown folks. Just in terms of, yes, they may show up with their degrees, they may show up with their licensures. However, what's their training? What are their treatment modalities? What is their education in terms of their understanding, or trying to understand communities that they serve, and what that looks like in terms of, if you are a clinician that's trying to work in Baltimore City schools, whatever schools may have you, understanding how that community got to the place where they are, and seeing our children as whole, not as high risk, not as just simply angry, but understanding what happened last night to have this child upset, what happened in his community, that the reason why this community is facing the challenges that it's facing. The Black community is not the Thriller video where you just had zombies just pop up and just vicious and angry and tearing apart folks. That's just not true. That's a false narrative, and becomes problematic when you have folks coming in with the white savior complex that they're going to save Black children, and you didn't take the time out to honor who they are, and more so practice humility. And you end up doing more harm than good. And I think it's incumbent that folks are saying more human services, more social workers, et cetera, in these spaces. But I have to caution folks with that, because what we end up doing in that space is we end up just funneling more money to human services and inflating the larger institutions, white-led institutions, that both absorb the bulk of resources in our communities. And to be honest, folks don't get served that way. And that could be whether we're talking about the police, that could be whether we're talking about having them in our school system, where you have white-led large organizations that are getting these contracts with Baltimore City schools to do the work. But to be frank, you don't know what the hell that you're doing. And you having folks coming into the communities they never came into. They only stepped foot in these communities when they were doing their internships while they was in their school social work programs. And you didn't know what you were doing then. You were intimidated by 8th graders. I've seen that. So these are, among the problems that I have seen and continue to see when you talk about how do human service agencies partner up and show up in our schools, and how that can be detrimental to folks. And I will also say that within this conversation about anti-racism, although I have my challenges around that word, we have to understand that we as Black folks, brown folks, people in color in general, our existence didn't start with racism, when white folks discovered us. So with that, the reason why I do what I do with Reflection of Kings is understanding positive racial identity and understanding what it means to love yourself, love your Blackness, center your Blackness, and why that's so important for your self-esteem and your self-concept, and what that does for you when you feel good about who you are, not ashamed of who you are. I heard Sister Breon talk about speaking white and what it means to talk Black. And if you see a Black student or a Black person reading that they must be acting white, that's an example of internalized racism. That, these are extensions of the idea that what is best is only reserved for white people, first and foremost. And that becomes problematic when you, as a person of color, start to believe that about yourself and think less of yourself based on your language, the way you talk, your culture, etc. And you uphold white folks as if they are the supreme. And that is the ideology of white supremacy, important for us to understand. So when we talk about what are the effects of this and the mental health of our children, if you think less than who you are and you believe your identity is trash, I would argue that there is some self-esteem issues, your self-concept, how you show up in the world. So it's important for us to understand the importance of affirming who you are and your identity and lifting that first. And racism is an attack on that. Mm-hmm. That's not your birth. Racism is an attack on your identity.
So Bobby, you always bring it. And I surely appreciate you. And I want to just tune in on two things you said that I think we heard throughout. One is that it is not taken away from white people to lift up your own identity, to believe you come from strength and you come from power. And those things often get conflated, which is why we see a lot of fear being stoked in people when we talk about teaching accurate American history, or we talk about having them do critical analysis on how it is possible that Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, all these folk are being extrajudicially harmed by a system established to harm them and to keep them in place. That, the concept that if you teach this accurate history, you're telling my white child that they are bad. And the short-sightedness of that, to say that I am reminding myself of my goodness, does not make me feel like you are bad. The things that happen to my people are bad. And so why can't we have those engagements and really unpack that so that we move to a place where we're able to use all the things we know to allow for people to be their truest selves. The last thing I'll say before I turn it back over to Sarah, our mistress of ceremonies, is a big mistake that I see in organizing is when people are, and I talk about that long game, is when people are short-sighted. If you are doing work, whether it's anti-racism, whether it's racial equity, whether it's making sure every child in Maryland has access to a public school, and notice I said every child, not every citizen, because if you're here in our borders, the law says that that child deserves access to a quality education. It is to not be so short-sighted and to diminish your long game by not identifying the other sectors that you also need to serve as a voice for. So it cannot be the case that I do education advocacy, I do education advocacy, I do education advocacy, and you don't know why you need to talk about, to Bobby's point, policies related to healthcare and access to social services, policies related to housing, policies related to transportation, so that people can access good jobs and not have to be pulled out of their community. Think about your own language when you say to kids, you can go to Harvard. Don't tell my child they can go to Harvard. They already know that. Right? Don't tell my child they can go to Harvard. They already know that. Harvard is not the ideal, right? And telling kids, if you work hard, you can get out the hood. Why? That hood made them who they are. And so using messages like get out the hood and go to someplace better is inherently racist. It is inherently telling children that the biggest part of you that built you is there's something wrong with it and you gotta leave. And that's why people don't come back after they've gone off to college, whether it's Harvard or Howard or Morgan or Morehouse, whatever the case may be, or Michigan, wherever they go, that they're like, I don't want to go back there. I fought to get out of there. You may fight to get out of particular circumstances, but where you're from is perfect because you are perfect. So just want to make sure as we look at the long game, as you continue to do breakouts and go through the rest of the session today, you're really thoughtful about your own language. You're thoughtful about, what is the ecosystem? What are the social determinants of a quality education? Because it cannot be the single schoolhouse. What policies are we thinking about to advance our work? So I want to thank you, Bobby. I want to thank you, Desiree. I want to thank you, Edwin. I want to thank you, Jadi. And thank you all for having me. I am in between two sessions, so I'm going to jump out after this, but thanks so much to ARMS. I'm so proud of all of you. And Sarah, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you. That was extremely informative, inspiring, immaculate, all the good words that you could say that starts with I. Have a nice day, Khalilah Harris. But we will continue with the program. We want to hear from all of you in small breakouts, but first we do have another inspiring performance. I will give the floor to Stan Substantial Robinson. And before that, I'll also add that Stan is an international hip hop recording artist, educator, and visual artist from Prince George's County, Maryland. As a rapper and a producer, he has traveled around the world and he has worked with well-known artists and has inspired countless youth as an educator working with the Baltimore City and PG County schools. So let's welcome Stan.
All right, appreciate you. Peace, everybody. I hope all is well with you and yours. I appreciate y'all for having me. And yeah, man, just salute to each and every one of you doing the work. It's extremely important work. I appreciate the love. I just saw that in the chat. Thank you so much. So just a little bit more about me real quick before I hit play. I've been working in education for as long as I've been doing music professionally. So for over 20 years, I've been serving different communities that I've lived in. And even when I tour, sometimes going into the community as well, whether the events are fundraisers or we're going into Cook County, correctional facilities when we're out in Chicago, places like that. Just always doing the work. And just reinforcing the fact that hip hop in itself has been doing this work since the onset. And I know a lot of people have different opinions of what rap music is, but be clear when I'm talking about hip hop, I'm talking about the culture of hip hop and the different elements. The original 5 elements of hip hop aren't just MCing, breaking, DJing, and graffiti, but the 5th element is knowledge. So many educators that I've met over the years are also hip hop artists and have been doing that work. They're just not necessarily on your TV screen and in all the magazines getting to talk about the work that we're always doing. So I just wanted to start with that so you understand who I am and what I really represent. And yeah, let's get into it. Shout out to PG County, all my PG County folk up here. Shout out to my Baltimore folk as well. My family, I see you. So let's get into it. Peacemaker, son of a violent man, dream chaser, raised on divided land with thieves, rapists, treated like I'm not a man. I behavior like rebels without a plan. Step false, get off by a coward's hand. Life shorter than an hour hand. But the least of our worries ain't the Taliban and hoping that they'll pass an assault rifle ban, because most guns where I'm from aren't licensed, fam. The ones that are usually held tight in hands by the cops or so-called authority figures cringe at my black skin while calling us but 6 letters can't define me. I'm so much bigger. The path I walk, most people can't endure the rigor. Back up talk by displaying so much vigor. Mastered art, the blind just ignore the picture. Grab the tart, but of course my portion's bitter. That or star, cause round here they don't deliver. Grab the court, rather be engulfed in liquor, lack support. And I wasn't born a winner in afterthought. These know-it-alls won't consider a man of God who sit upon throne of wicker, scratched and clawed to reach the very point I'm sitting. After all, that's what fuel the poems I'm spitting. So I'm gonna take this pain I've been dealt with and use it. The ship can't reach the stars if I don't fuel it. Without my music, it ought to be useless. I always knew what I had to do. So I'm gonna take this pain I've been dealt with and use it. The ship can't reach the stars if I don't fuel it. Without my music, it ought to be useless. I always knew what I had to do. Yeah. All right. Once again, y'all, my name is Substantial. Thank y'all so much.
Okay.
Salute.
Thank you.
Peace. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I'm a 2000s baby, but that took me back. I mean, like, that took me all the way back. Anyways, now we'll hear from Jamal Jones, the executive director from the Baltimore Algebra Project. He will talk to us about the movement that we're building, and you'll have a chance to join in the small group discussion afterwards.
What up, squad? I'm just really taken back from the performances. I ain't seen Sarah smile like that. And forever. What it is, Bobby? So we heard from a whole lot of people today about a whole bunch of stuff, and it's really, really juicy information. Some of it was colored in poetry, some of it was colored in like other artistry, like rap. And then we had some really, really eloquent words and some real truth in the spoken. And a lot of that is bringing up, for me at least, the question of what is it going to take to actually move the needle on some of this stuff and actually recreate or reinvent what does it look like to actually deliver education for our folks in these schools under an anti-racist model. And so what that's bringing up also is like this understanding of like in history, when people have been able to make substantial change in like communities, it's been people moving together and people working in unison. And so, I mean, it's really clear that we're going to need a movement. And it can't just be one city. It can't be just one county. It can't just be one organization. It can't just be one individual advocate. And that's kind of what the role of ARMS is. This is a coalition that is statewide, and the role of it, honestly, is to be able to have a container for people who really want to go hard, really want to be in the mix as it pertains to really changing the dynamic and the color and the flavor of our schools in Maryland so that we can produce something different for our folks. That's what we trying to do here without all the fancy words that go on the grant work. All that to say, right, what happened in the last session, we had a couple folks that were around the table, guests, Dr. LaShawn and a couple other folks, and we worked on some bills. In particular, we had this one bill, the Decolonizing Education Bill, which is kind of like, it was to create, I'll give you the baseline and then like my summary. The goal was to create a commission that would have us be able to look at and evaluate the education standards here in Maryland so that we could figure out what made sense to take out, what made sense to add, so that we could have more equitable representation in like at least the curriculum. And ideally, the commission would be able to put forth recommendations that would touch on other things, because you can't just speak to one piece of the student's educational experience and expect for everything to be different, right? Like that's what we talk about with these wraparound services, connectedness to community and other organizations and institutions. But interestingly enough, as boisterous as we got blocked and stonewalled, and it was mostly because on the Senate side, there was the chair of the education committee who functionally decided that because we didn't have an impact on his particular electoral like position. Like most of the folks who were at the table or like around the conversation didn't necessarily impact him being reelected in his constituency. He wasn't even going to bring the bill up for a vote, which got it killed in crossover, which meant all the hard work that folks was working on and put in basically got killed in the drawer. I don't know if folks ever heard that phrase before, but a bill gets placed inside of the drawer and that's how you kill it. But all that to say, building up this coalition, building up this container, building up the capacity to all the folks who've been on this call today, and anyone who you think would be interested in this work is functionally what we'll be working on for the next kind of couple of months and what we're trying to build up for the next session. In a second, we're going to switch out the breakouts, and basically we got some questions for folks to answer really quickly. Thank you for staying with us. And Frank just dropped the link down in the chat for the survey that we want all of you to fill out once you get a chance. So I guess I will cue Sergio for breakouts.
All right, y'all, we're going to be here in these breakouts for 20 minutes, and then we come back for a quick closing.